part of the Press Play Podcast Network.
Welcome to Producing While Asian. This is your host, Don Mike Mendoza, and today's conversation is with Deb Sivigny, who is a arts educator, a writer, and a designer. She is based in Washington, D.C., and I'm so happy to have her because we've been trying to connect for a while, and today's conversation is going to be really awesome. So I hope you enjoy, and welcome again to Producing While Asian. Well, hello, Deb. Thank you so much for being here, and welcome to the Producing While Asian podcast. It's so good to have you.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So we're going to hop into all the things. So I know you and I haven't been in the same room in a while, and so it's so good to connect with you again. So for our audience, just tell everybody kind of a little bit about yourself and a little bit about your journey and, you know, how you kind of took the road to end up where you are.
Oh my goodness, you might have to steer me through this as I turn to ramble. You'd be like, shape that. Hi, Deb Sivigny. I've been in the DC area working as everything from a designer, writer, producer, but mostly designer, and then sort of overall, artist. It's all changing in these pandemic times, but I've been here for about 20 years and teaching, educating. Yeah, I've really been all over the map in this sort of crazy journey. So it's actually hard to encapsulate. But I am originally from New England. I grew up in Connecticut, went to college in Vermont. All my roots are sort of in the Northeast, and came to Maryland to go to University of Maryland and work as an apprentice at Olney Theater. And from there, I thought I might leave, and then the jobs kept coming, so I never left. And so I've made my home here for a long time, mostly as a costume designer. That's sort of where my background mostly lies. And then maybe in the past 10 years, more formally as a scenic designer. And now I'm an educator of both at George Mason University.
That's awesome. So you're mostly in costume design and at this moment in time. So how do you kind of know which way to go with your kind of artistic projects, because you have a lot that comes at you and you have a lot of different sets of skills. How do you prioritize the ones that will move you forward, so to speak?
Yeah, lately, I think I decided about 5 years ago that I was only going to take projects that scared me to death. I think that my career, I've always been a bit of a restless person. So 20 years ago, started as a costume designer, sort of decided at the age of 20, I'm going to go do this, and have forged that path forward. And then 15 years in, got a little restless. It's like, there's got to be something else. I want to do more world building. And then went into scenic design, which scared me, but I wanted an opportunity to be able to world build and sort of have more of a hand in how a piece was directed. And that was one way I could find to do that without formally jumping into directing myself, because that's not a skill set that I have. And then from there, got a little more restless and was like, oh, now I want to write, and then I became part of this playwrights collective and did some writing, and all those things together have, sort of coalesced into this sort of multi-hyphenate career where now I'm doing a little bit of everything all at once. Mm-hmm. And I think in picking projects that have challenged me and scared me in a lot of ways, that's how I keep pushing myself forward and how I sort of quell the restlessness, even though it leads to a bit of a life of anxiety. I've learned a lot. It's just, it's allowed me to sort of broaden my worldview in how I view theater, which is pretty holistically. So
sure. Yeah, it's interesting how much, it's always been this way, but becoming almost like a one-man band in our industry where you have to have skills at many things, because you don't know sometimes you don't know where your next paycheck's going to be. And it's always good to just have a lot of skill sets. And, but then you find the one that works for you and it really, goes well. And, in a community like DC that's, big but small, you definitely fall into a really great pattern of just work after work after work once you get in the door, which is awesome. So in those different columns that you sit in, tell us about kind of, because Producing While Asian, we're here because we want to talk to people like us, people who identify as AAPI, and hear, kind of their stories and kind of hopefully inspire other people to follow or to help make change. Because in most cases, a lot of us are pioneers in our line, or close to the pioneer, just because, there's not a lot of us. And so tell us a little bit about like, interesting challenges you faced as, not just BIPOC, but also female identifying and, all of that. What are kind of challenges that you've seen that, you feel you've made some change in, and also you hope to see more change in,
Absolutely. Oh, it's a big question.
Yeah,
I think,
big question.
yeah. And for me, it's complicated. It relates very closely to my background. So, you'll note my last name is Sivigny. It's not a married name or anything like that. I'm a Korean adoptee. And so my whole life has been this sort of journey of discovery and rediscovery of what it means to be Asian, and finding that sort of, it's kind of a niche identity within the Asian American community. I mean, there are a lot of us, especially from Korea. There's 300,000 of us around the world, all adopted between like 1955 and the 90s. And so I think I found that actually engaging with the Korean adoptee community in like the past decade gave me a moment of sort of empowerment to sort of frame myself as Asian, and that's like a good thing and okay. But it's always been a very complicated identity for me. I was raised by a Taiwanese mother, so in some ways I grew up Chinese American. So I was very familiar with like Chinese things and cultural traditions in that way. But she also she was born in the late 30s. She wanted me to assimilate. So it was like Chinese mom who's like, nope, I'm not going to teach you Chinese. Nope, you're going to assimilate. You're going to be all these things, but also with this sort of classic Asian parent mentality of you will get A's, you will be perfect. I'm like, all right. Right. So in that way, I very much identify with, I suppose, the tropes, of the identity.
Sure. Yeah.
But it's only been in the past like 10, 15 years. And I'm like, oh, right, it's more than tropes. We are people. We are valid. We are whole. And I think in stepping into that, I was finally able to be like, okay, now I know where I stand, in this community and what I can stand up for. And it's just, I don't know, it's opened me up to more opportunities, but it's also just like been super eye-opening when I talk to groups of BIPOC artists or students. And I'm just like, yep, for a very long time, I saw myself as white. And they're all like,
me too.
What? And I'm like, no, I needed to assimilate to exist in Connecticut. It just was how I was going to make it through. And then, I'd be on the playground or the school bus and somebody would taunt me and I'd remember that I was different and it hurt. And so like all those periods that I think many BIPOC folk have gone through and feel, yes, I felt that too, but I thought I could just like crush it down, and be like, I'm going to be all right. So I guess since then I've become much more, I don't know, militant is too strong a word, but I've become much more forthright about talking about it and trying to call out inequity while also trying to navigate the landscape that Asians sit in a very particular spot, unfortunately, in what we might call the oppression Olympics. I don't like to play that game, but I see it. So this is one of those moments where I find that a lot of times I'm calling for intersectionality and an acknowledgement that like we all have to exist in this space together. Let's try to talk through the issues, not ignore them. But I do find lately that I've been in these positions where I'm like, oh, I'm calling things out, and that's risky. Yeah. But I know that if I don't do it,
who will? Right?
Who's going to?
Saying, well, if I don't do it, maybe the other person will. And everybody does the same pattern, then nobody does, Right. And everyone just stays silent. And then we are complicit in supremacy again and again and again. So I'm trying to turn that over in my life and get brave more often. And, I look up to, especially my Black, sisters and brothers and people in the ways that they've been standing up for years. And I'm like, why am I still so afraid? So I'm trying to step into that power, and I'm finally starting to see it as power. I think for a long time, I just was afraid. I have a problem with being afraid of everything. My work, but but again, I'm like, okay, I'm gonna do what terrifies me, and I'm just gonna try to get to do it. So in a way, I feel like obviously we've all talked about how people of color have been, in a way pitted against each other because of like that, how useful we are to the oppressor. But, I feel like we are able to, like, now that we're kind of, and I hate to say becoming more woke, like, now that we're kind of seeing and understanding and like, really knowing, okay, well, here are the things we can do, especially within our industry, it's, in the way of like taking that division that the oppressor has sown and using it to our advantage, right? And saying, okay, well, I'm going to use my so-called given privilege in this terrible system that's created and use it to help other people within my community and other BIPOC people to hopefully help push us all forward. But, it is hard, just because we've been culturally trained in our ways to not, especially with AAPI people, like you were saying, your adoptive mother, like we were, she was an assimilator, as were my parents. My parents were the immigrants too from the Philippines, and they were assimilators, and they wanted me to also assimilate. And like anytime an AAPI person talks to me about their experience of thinking they're white, I'm like, like I felt that many, many times. And, I went to a very predominantly white school for middle and high school. And there were a lot of times where I kind of went along and was like, what's so bad about this? And then somebody would remind me and I'd be like, oh, that's right. That's right.
Right. And then and then in retrospect, I think for me personally, it comes with a bit of shame that I like wasted some time, not like standing up for myself, but also like middle school is a cruel place and you just want to fit in and like, it's just so difficult in predominantly white spaces that, because I often wonder, like my parents moved from Bridgeport, Connecticut to Durham, Connecticut. So we went from like a city, very culturally diverse, to the country. And they wanted me to go to better schools. I get it. But I often wonder if I had gone to magnet school and like become bilingual in Spanish and English, maybe my life would have been different. I'm not sure. But I often wonder about that.
It's never too late, I would say, you can always learn another language and all that. But so I guess taking those experiences, how do you use that to inform the way you carry yourself as a professional in our industry, because, that oppression very much exists in the theater industry and entertainment and, and in worse ways than we could have imagined sometimes. And, how do you take those experiences and use that as almost like your like armor and motivation to keep pushing forward and keep, staking your claim in this community that we're part of? How are you doing that in your career?
I mean, certainly it's a good barometer for the work that I take. And certainly in pandemic, I've been thinking, but I've been working at it pre-pandemic as this conversation has been going on for years. I am actively looking at companies and spaces and shows and looking at the sort of complement of people who run the theater, who are working on the project, and trying my best. It's, avoidable sometimes depending on what information you have, but to not be the only person of color on a team. If I'm working on an Asian show, to not be the only Asian on the team, which has happened, which is like horrifying. And you look around and you're like, oh, am I going to be supported here? And it's not just because, I guess, let me put this out there. It is not just because I'm like looking for people who look like me, because I mean, obviously all over the Asian spectrum, there are many, many, many different perspectives on like what it means to be Asian, to be an Asian person in this world. And so it's not just about that, because I think that some companies who don't have a good perspective on this will just like get a whole bunch of Asians in a room and be like, look, we have an all Asian cast and crew. And I'm like, that's nice. No one on this team is actually Chinese and we're doing a Chinese play, or, whatever that means. So I'm looking around for just a support network. And if not people of that ethnicity or that culture or that tradition, I'm looking for people that I can trust. And I'm looking for, I guess I'm just looking for allies. So I've been a lot more critical of the work that I take, which means I'm taking less work, which I don't know, is something to get used to, because I think so much about the grind and urgency and done all those things that, we've sort of grown accustomed to in the theater that just honestly lead to more tired and more oppression and all those things. It's just allowing me to like remind myself that being part of a team that is a nurturing environment is more important than I've ever given it credit for in the past. I've been a part of enough shows where I'm like, wow, I really don't want to be here. It's that after a while you get wise, and I'm trying to spread that as an educator to my students too, to be like, if you're in a place where you're uncomfortable, get out. Or even better, do your research before you think you might go into a place that is uncomfortable. And if you think you might be uncomfortable, start asking questions, because you have every right to know who is in that room, who is making these decisions. So I think as I'm coming into my sort of own power through these realizations, I'm trying my best to pass it on to the next generation, because they're going to build the next iteration of the theater and really live it as they want to. But I already feel for some of them, like they're already starting to get crushed by like practices now deemed oppressive. And it's really hard. I've tried to break the cycle of like, I think when I came into my internship this is now many years ago, so like 20 something years ago, I came out with the impression, and I think this is true with many internships, of, oh, well, I took my lumps and I worked for like little to no money. And I was taken advantage of, I mean, not just this theater, but in general, as being a young artist. I experienced all these things. And so when I pass it to the next generation, I'm like, you too need to experience these same things. I'm like, no, I actually am trying to actively break that cycle. Right. Because there's still a lot of people with the mentality of, well, I took my lumps, you need to take your lumps. And that's a rite of passage. And I'm like, no, we're gatekeeping our own people. And we can't do that anymore. So.
And just the fear of that, competition, like it's the idea that, oh, we can't have more than one of us in the space because it means that somebody has to be better than the other one, that we can't all collaborate. And I think it's also just like you, when I encounter younger artists, what I try to impose on them is saying no is okay.
Yes.
And in partnership with what you said about get out if you're uncomfortable. Like nobody is making you stay there. Okay, yes, maybe there's a financial stake for you, obviously, but if it's really, unsafe, there are other ways to make money, and you don't have to get that job right now in that moment to be successful later, and that like if you have to take another job that may be adjacent to what you're doing until you land the actual job in the arts that you want, just because you wanted to feel safer, that's okay, and that nobody's going to shame you for that.
And if they do, you don't want to work for them.
Exactly. Right. If they shame you, then no. And like breaking the cycle of the idea that hard work and grit is honorable when exhausting yourself really isn't, and just causes major problems for you personally moving forward. And so then you just perpetuate that myth that working hard all the time means you are actually successful.
And I think there's something like American in that work ethic, but man, there's also something Asian in that of like, you will work hard, you will practice, you will get better, and then you'll be the best. And it's just so, it can be so soul crushing.
Oh yeah. Have you ever had an experience where maybe your parents or a relative has said to you, oh, I've had it where I'm kind of not complaining, but just venting about something difficult. And the response is, well, be grateful because you've got that. Because if you're not grateful for that, there are people that don't have that, and that could be you instead. Instead of like, oh yeah, that really sucks. It's deal with it because like you have a job, Right.
I know. It always comes out in at least you have a job, or at least blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, grateful is a word that has often given me issue too. It's like it's an adoption thing of like, oh, adoptees should be grateful. Like I could be dead on the streets, I could be dead in a dumpster, whatever those horrible, terrible situations are, which like, yeah, sure, but like,
it shouldn't be. I feel like grateful shouldn't be weaponized.
Shouldn't be held against you,
right? Like you should be grateful just you're grateful, not because you're forced to be.
Right.
So,
it's an obligation when that.
Right.
Hey, I'm Jason.
And I'm Gary, and we love ball cards.
And if you love ball cards too, good news. You just found your new favorite podcast. From breaks to grading,
And from collecting to flipping, join us on the Ball Card Show.
the sports podcast for the sports collector.
Hi, this is Deb Sivigny, and you're watching Producing While Asian.
So I kind of want to lean more into something you mentioned earlier. So a lot of my friends who are Korean adoptees were typically adopted by white people. You know, I'm sure you know others, but it's like, you know, how does your experience compare to theirs as someone who's adopted by another Asian culture? You know, like that's fascinating to me.
Mm-hmm. And I find it's true. I'm sort of in the minority, at least, of people adopted, you know, in the late 70s and 80s. Because yeah, it mostly was like Midwestern white Christian parents, you know. I mean, and the whole like white savior trope is real. Not with everybody, but you know, in comparing experiences, I find that, because I have met other adoptees who do have like one Asian parent, and it is interesting to sort of talk to them about it, because my mom was that of sort of an assimilator, but I was also surrounded by things that she had brought from Taiwan, and you know, so I saw it and I had a lot of questions about it, and I was exposed to magazines and pictures and this kind of thing, but it always was sort of brushed aside as to, oh, well, you don't need to look at that. Oh, well, you can't read that anyway. Or no, I'm not going to tell you what that is. And I'm just like, oh, wow. So in some ways, I do share the like white parent thing, and then growing up in a white majority space. And like my mom was pretty singular. It was just her. And when her relatives came to visit, it would be like her niece and nephew, and they'd be in for like a week, and they would bring presents, and that was nice, you know, but like that's pretty normal to be a kid and have that happen. And then I spent the rest of my time with my dad's family. So they were all white and, you know, of French Canadian descent and others. So it was mostly, I guess it was mostly like being around a whole bunch of white people, but you know, again, like I didn't really think about it very much as
of course, because it was just your family. And you're like, that's
and I was just like, oh, that's what it is. And actually, funny later, like I was hanging out with a friend in Colorado. When we were very much adults. I was working at the Shakespeare Festival there, and he was living in Boulder, and we got together for dinner. And I was talking about my family, because he was asking, because we used to be good friends as kids. And then he said to me, no shame in this, but he was like, oh, I thought you were homegrown. Like he just thought that I was like the biracial child of my parents. And I was like, oh, that's interesting.
Oh, well, you know.
So, I mean, I wonder in retrospect how much it affected my childhood friendships and how much they even thought about it. But I've also had friends from home say to me, oh, well, I just thought of you as white. Which in one era of my life, I would have been like, oh, okay, sure. And I would have just gone along with it and maybe made a joke to like make myself feel better. But now I'm like, ouch, that really hurts. So it's resonated differently in different parts of my life.
Sure. It kind of falls under that saying like, oh, I don't see color. It kind of falls under that. We're like, oh, I just see you as white. You know?
Right. And I'm like, oh, nice.
Yeah,
so,
thank you.
yeah.
I appreciate that.
I know, you're like, oh.
And for us, right, and for us with that, you know, their assumption that to us that's a compliment. And
right.
Not something that's like actually kind of hurtful.
And you don't have the words for a long time, I think, to like refute that. You're like, oh, that's how you see me. Well, actually, I'm different, you know, and they're like, but why would you want to be different? I'm like, oh my God, I don't want to get into this.
Right. So,
it's too difficult.
Talk to us a little bit about your writing, and you know, when you decided to go down that route, how much of your past experiences and life are now informing that? You know, like what are you? You know, there was another writer that I interviewed, and she says hello to you, Amanda L. Andre.
Oh,
yeah, and so she was like so excited that I was going to talk to you too, and you know, I asked her the same question, kind of. How does your identity and your experiences inform your decision to explore and go into becoming a writer?
Yeah. So I had a major work, it's like first, but not last, work in 2017 called Hello, My Name Is, which I produced as part of the Welders, which is a playwrights collective here in DC that still goes on, and it's their generation, and they've got a show going on right now, and they're just awesome. But when I was there, who was it? It was Annalisa Diaz, actually, who brought me into the idea of becoming a welder. And the original thought, she said, would you consider coming in and being like our resident designer for a couple of years? Because they were looking at making sort of a traditional cohort, of writers and other people. And I said, well, I get enough design gigs and I love new plays. Like, it really is my first love. But I don't know if I want to be like a designer, attached to a playwrights cohort for 3 years. And I said, how would you feel about me writing a piece? And she was like, oh, wow. Yeah. Then she got really into that. Okay. So here I was, part of this playwrights collective and writing a proposal on what I thought I would do. And, they say, write what you know. And so I said, okay, I'm going to write about myself. Right. And so ended up actually putting together, because I'm just an overthinker, but I'm also a dramaturg. So I started interviewing other Korean adoptees to start getting into, like, are our stories similar? Yeah. Are all the tropes about being found outside a police station in a box, is that all true? And then that coincided with taking a trip back to Korea, writing and just journaling the entire time, and finding that I could process through my own experience as an adoptee and the other experiences from these surveys and 7 or 8 interviews that I had done, and just meeting people there and coalescing that into a story, but also finding that my heart was really, in immersive theater, and finding a way to design an experience so that audience members would actually also feel all the same emotions by literally sitting feet from the action and being in a house and having that kind of experience. So all those sort of wants and desires of I just want to make theater that I've never seen,
Yeah, of course.
Letting my design inform me as a writer. I think that it's still hard to think of myself as a writer. I think I'm a designer who writes. There are people who are like, oh no, you're absolutely a playwright. I'm like, yes, but it's a scratchy coat for me to wear, I think, because I don't think traditionally. I'm working on another play right now that literally has no actors. It is just a boat and a bunch of artifacts, and audience members go and they experience the life of the former occupants of the boat through the stuff.
That's
and so
awesome.
Yeah, so I'm trying to think of what are actorless experiences or what are design driven experiences. And so in that, I find the necessity to write, to be able to communicate what I want, but it also comes with a heavy visual component to sort of explain how all those things work together. So yes, writer. Yes, yeah. My experiences as a designer continue to inform, and I continue to write about Korea. That's the other thing, is this other play is about North Korean fishermen trying to escape the Hermit Kingdom, and they end up dead, spoilers, but that's why they're not on the boat, and so this ghost ship washes up on the west coast of Japan, which is based in a true New York Times article that I found years ago, and I was like, I have to do something with this. So I've just been reading about North Korea for the past, 2-3 years voraciously. Every book that comes out about North Korea, I'm reading. So
that's so cool. So on that note, being a writer and being a designer, but more so on the writer side of you, you have to also pursue opportunities to get your work produced. So it's the Welders is an amazing opportunity for that. And yes. Shout out to Colleen Sinette Jennings, who's my teacher from college.
Yes, Colleen.
And, the best. And, on a scale of 1 to producer now, where do you sit there? And, in terms of sitting in the producer's seat, whether it's to get your work produced or to get it in the room or to talk about, the way it'll be designed, kind of where do you think you sit on that scale and why? And just so there's no wrong answer to this question.
Yeah.
It's just out of curiosity, what do you think about that?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. I mean, okay, my instinct is like, oh, like 6, and this is my self-esteem talking, right? To be like, well, I'm a great producer, so I should say 10. I think honestly, spiritually, I'm probably like a 2. Having been a welder, having produced, like I think that it's not something I want to run headlong into, but I know that I have that full complement of skills to do so. I think I would just rather be, I don't know, I'm often happier as sort of like boots on the ground supporting an effort. And I think it's just because I've spent so long as a designer that I sort of see myself in the middle. I'm there, I'm supporting the production, and I want to do everything I want to do. But I also see, like I'm married to a producer, Randy Baker of Rorschach Theater. So knowing that, like the work that he and Jenny do all the time, and I'm like, it amazes me. And I also like, I'd never want to do that, but I want to help. I'm interested in the effort, but I don't. I will say this: I don't want to be held accountable, to hold up an entire company.
Sure.
But I want to be part of the effort. So I don't know. I'm a team player, but I'm also a bit of a lone wolf. So spiritually a 2. Sure. Skill set 6.5. I don't know.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a great answer, because there's a lot of people that sit in that same spot. That they can produce if they want to, but just like you're saying, that like being a producer, there's a lot of pressure there.
Oh, it's amazing.
Because you're essentially, I say this to everyone, you're essentially the den mom. Like you have to make sure, even more, like you also have to make sure that people like the stage manager are okay. And the stage manager is like preparing for everybody else. So you're the mama or papa bear to whatever is happening.
And I love that role, but I'm too empathetic, I think. I carry everybody's emotion. I think this is all my experience as a costume designer, is like I carry a lot of secrets, and like that's just, people just tell me things and I'm like, great, I'm gonna hold that, I'm gonna hold that, I'm gonna hold that. And I know myself as a producer, because I did this on my own play, like, you're holding so much all the time. And so I think like a one-time experience, or once every 5-10 years, cool. All the time, I would explode.
Hello, Brooks here with the Books with Brooks monthly book club podcast. We read one book a month and then we talk about it. Books like Stephen King's The Shining or Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens. If you're on the hunt for book recommendations and enjoy sparkling conversation, come read along with us and then listen in.
Hey everybody, it's Sam Amico from Cavs on the Break NBA podcast. Be sure to give us a listen for all your Cleveland Cavaliers recaps, analysis, breakdowns, draft talk, free agency. The list goes on and on. Give us a listen, Cavs on the Break NBA podcast.
Hi, this is Deb Sivigny, and you're watching Producing While Asian.
So, let me think. Tell me a little bit about kind of when those parts of you crossed. So, I guess when you produce your own play. So, when you were the writer and the producer, when you had to balance multiple roles and not just be one of those. Talk to us a little bit about that experience and what you would impart to somebody who might end up in that same spot.
I know, right? I think so. I was producing, so I was sort of like lead. We call ourselves lead producing playwright, and so you are in the writing seat, the casting seat. You're in every meeting. I was also essentially set designing and conceiving it, and I was like in rehearsals. The funny part is that, like, a side note here, I had never really spent dedicated time in rehearsal despite being a designer all these years. Designers come in for like first rehearsal, we might be there for a day or two, table work, in design run, tech. Right. I had an inkling about what people did in rehearsal and what directors did in rehearsal. And when I actually sat in rehearsal, I was like, oh, this is what you do in rehearsal. Oh, I have a job. Okay. Oh, I need to rewrite that scene. Okay. And it really opened my eyes just to the other half of theater, just having spent exclusive time, on the other side. So I think that for someone wearing multiple hats, actually having a good idea about what you're about to get into is like a really good idea. And there's no better way, than to just sort of throw yourself in headlong. But I think that there was something really thrilling about wearing all those hats at once. Granted, I wasn't doing anything else at the time. I had taken no other projects. I'd really tried my best to clear my schedule. So it was like my day job at Georgetown at the time, and then working on this show every other minute I had. Yeah, just giving it as much space and time as possible. When I was doing the writing before casting and doing that kind of thing, I tend to work in spurts. So I would like go get an Airbnb for 3-4 days, and I would just write constantly, for 3-4 days, just content, and then I'd throw half of it out and whatever. And I just knew that if I continued to work at that sort of pace and give myself retreats and time, and then just put it down for a while to go do everything else and then pick it up again, that was my own rhythm. But I think that knowing your working style is like really important, because I think had I gone in and ground at it for like an hour a day, I actually don't work that well in that kind of format, even though I know that fully works for others. So I think knowing your own patterns and tendencies is really useful going in as a producer, especially with one with all the other duties as well. Yeah. And some days I would just say, today I'm a designer, and I would tell the people around me, like, please don't ask me questions about these checks that have been cut, or please don't, don't talk to me about finances today. I can't. I just have to paint this wall. And so compartmentalizing myself into like 6 or 7 parts to be like, this Deb is wearing the designer hat, and this Deb is wearing the playwright hat today, and dividing my day in those sort of chunks. It just helped me like get through. But also, I loved it, and I would totally do it again tomorrow. Like it was sort of a masochistic, beautiful experience. But I had all of the right people around me. I had handpicked every single person on my team, and there's so much power, but just sheer joy in that. Like every designer that I talked to on the team, like we had like 2-hour-long coffee conversations before I was even, I'd say like, I'm really interested in working with you on this. Let's chat for several hours to see if this is something you're interested in, because I wanted a design forward piece. So I needed designers not to be reactive, but proactive. And that's a very different relationship for a designer to have to a show. Like Rock Lee, for instance. I said, Rock, what are you interested in experimenting with in this show? And he said, oh, I've always wanted to work with like an FM transmitter and headphones in a show and immersing people inside this. And I was like, great. So I wrote the airplane sequence for Rock, to have this like 8-minute beautiful audio experience, And that wouldn't have been there had he not said that to me, because I wouldn't have known it was a possibility. So yeah. I think there can be beautiful moments of just being in the producer's seat and being, that sort of central to creation that I would do it any day.
I think that's amazing. I mean, just like the level of collaboration in that sense, where it's, your designer isn't just there at your pleasure, so to speak, like they have some input, they have, something to say, and you actually listen, is great. And I think in a lot of BIPOC culture, there's a lot of like community aspects and collaborative aspects. And I think it's awesome that we're all together trying to bring that more into the forefront of our industry, because it really was a European style way of creating, where it's like you have one person, they create it, everybody else follows suit, and then it is what it is, Right. So it's exciting to see that change and to know that there are people like you that are making that, a bigger thing. And, I'm sure our listeners are going to appreciate hearing that too, because, there's probably a million other people out there who are like, I wonder if that's a thing. And it is, it's a thing. You can do it. Yeah. So it's, that's why I love this podcast. There's just so many things that we talk about that the feedback I get is like, I thought I was the only one that thought that. And, to hear it from somebody else who looks like me or is from my culture, is great. So now a little bit more of a fun question. So in your career, and you've, and this is something that I've encountered where like, I work and I do, and I work and I do, and I not that I miss things, but like I'll sit down, I'll finally have a moment to like look back and be like, oh wow, like I worked with that person, or I worked at that venue, or did that. It was awesome,
Mhm.
glad I could do that. Let us in on a little kind of awesome memory that you have that like you may in the beginning were like, oh, I really wish that would happen, or that's something that I hope to aspire to one day, or hopeful that would happen in my career, and then a moment where it did, like a moment where you got to collaborate with someone that you've been really wanting to collaborate with, or be and design in a venue that you've always dreamed of being part of. Talk to us like kind of one of those stories in your journey.
Yeah, it's so funny. I think I've been really lucky in my career actually to have many sort of revelations like this.
Yeah.
One of them, I mean, one of the pleasures of being in DC is that the Kennedy Center is like one of our local venues. And like that's when I was in high school, we take the senior trip to DC and we all go and see Sheer Madness in the Terrace Theater. But that was the first time that I'd been to DC. And so I was like looking around at this building, this amazing building with the flags and the red carpet. It just felt so beautiful and so vast, And then when I was just coming out of Oh no, it's actually midway through graduate school. So it would have been like early 2000s. I got invited to do a workshop with Ming Chu Lee and Constance Hoffman as part of the KCACTF and Greg Henry and, all that kind of work. And that was amazing. So I was like taking this masterclass in costume design with Constance Hoffman and talking about my concept for the Tempest in Indonesia with Dutch colonialism and shadow puppets, and getting to sort of talk through that with this like Broadway master. And then I think 3 or 4 years later, getting to design on that stage for their TYA program. So like those moments of like seeing it, going back and taking classes in it and actually getting to design there. And I remember just looking around and being like, oh my God, I'm here. And actually at one point my dad came to visit and I brought him to tech. And I said, well, Dad, tech's real boring. Like we just kind of sit in the dark and watch things happen over and over. But he was so excited and so fascinated. And I was like, right, what I'm doing is really cool. And so that was just like a really great moment of like, oh, did it.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Those odd little reminders too. I think it's hard to step out of yourself sometimes when it is just like the grind and you're like, oh, I'm so tired, I've been working a million hours. And then seeing a child's face after a show, or seeing my dad's face light up when he got to see the automation backstage and all that kind of stuff. It's a great reminder of what we do is really awesome.
Yeah, and important. And to now, have the opportunity to put out stories that are new and stories that, matter and are about people like us, and to show, like you said, show children that their stories matter too, that the story forever will not just be Cinderella, like that there will be, and nothing against Cinderella, I love that story, but like, that there are other stories, that their culture also matters. And so, that we have this, or that we have spaces being created for this purpose is awesome. And, I feel like, I've been in that same seat where it's like, well, here I'm the only Asian at this table. But I feel like, regardless of that, at least we're there and like we can call stuff out. But I agree that there should be more of us, not just one.
Right.
But, if you end up in that situation, there's a little bit of a head start. And maybe, if the company or the producer is nice enough, they will let us suggest other people to come in. Because my biggest pet peeve as a producer is seeing some production coming up that has people of color and it's not quite all that, what it's supposed to be. And then the excuse is, well, we couldn't find them. We couldn't, we didn't know where they were, or nobody showed up. And so I just want to like scream, rip my hair out and say, try harder, because they exist, they are here, and it's proof, proof in just who we all connect with, and proof in just putting this podcast together. Like when I sat down and started like writing down names of people who should be on here and interview, this list is so long. I could have like 20 seasons of people, and I'm just like, how do we then circle back to I don't know where they are. And you're like, okay.
Yeah, and you're like, they're right here.
right, they're right here in front of you. And so here we are. So I'm so happy to shout you out and put you out there and get more people like us in the room with you to create
Absolutely.
better and more work. So is there anything that you want to share with the audience that we might not have covered in this hour that, are outside of
God.
what we're discussing? Any tidbits of other wisdom that might not have touched on that you're just like, listen, kids, this is what you should think about into the future.
My gosh.
Please do.
Yeah. Oh, okay. It's like small soapbox. So like, I think it's awesome to watch communities come together and say, like, hire us, we're here, we're doing all these things. I think it's also really important on the flip to say that Asian designer, I mean, this people of color, but I'll put it in this context, is that like Asian actors, Asian designers, Asian creators, producers, etc., we belong in other spaces too. I think that it's like February is really busy because look, it's AAPI month or May or whatever, we deem it to be. Sorry, not February. But like it, but like everybody's got their month. So it's just sort of like, okay, great, May, AAPI month, hooray. Let's all do the Asian show. And then, end up on like 4 Asian shows. And everyone says, look at our very tired all Asian group. But like, I also want to design your play with white people, and I'm like perfectly capable of doing so. I've lived in your majority world for a long time, but like
I've watched it.
I know it, I've read it, it was part of my education, like I've analyzed it to death, like, yeah, I can do those too. So I think that like, I just don't want to see us get pigeonholed, nor do I want to self-pigeonhole. So I'm going to like stand up for the plays that I want to do. Like when Olney did Tiger Style, I called Jason Loeth. Like the second they announced it, I called Jason. I was like, I want to be on your short list. Thank you. Yeah. And I, was like, I don't, because in some ways being a 3rd gen kid, even though I'm an immigrant, I suppose, my experience is that much more of that of a 3rd generation Chinese person in some ways than it is like, someone who just, emigrated. But it, yeah, I don't know. There are going to be those plays where I'm like, okay, I really want to lean into this because actually I see a big chunk of my identity. And I'm actually leaning away from plays that I consider to be like cultural pageantry. Like I actually am not interested in working on like, I don't know, play like White Snake or something to be like, oh, here we are in ancient China. I don't know what that is, right. So literally anybody could design that. I might bring some cultural authenticity to it, but I might not. I would have to research that just as much as a white designer would have to research that. So I care less about those plays. And I want to see, I want to see Asian Americans working on like the modern plays where our identities and what we bring to the room is actually really critical to telling that story. Whereas like, well-researched historical play, sure, honestly, anybody could do that. And I don't get angry when I see white designers working on those because I'm like, sure, I'd have to do the same amount of research. I wasn't there in ancient China.
Yeah, right.
So
I agree, and it's just a hard balance to find, right? When I found when I was still majority acting, like trying to seek out the roles that weren't the pigeonholing cultural pageantry roles versus the roles that were like more modern and like just an Asian American person in real life. Yeah. And I feel like, in all aspects of our industry, we're trying to find that balance because like, I certainly don't want to be the producer who only produces, like historical pieces to teach people about, I don't know, like, or Here Lies Love. Like, I'm not going to produce Here Lies Love forever because like it's important. But, there's other stories to tell too, because that story is well known. Like we know. Yes. And then, so it's the same thing. I'm just like, I would like to produce the show that's about white people sometimes just because I can. Like I have the same skills, it's not
and
like
you can put Asians in those roles.
Exactly. We can mix it up. So I hope that that's the future of where we're at and how we're all working with each other because it's, just got to do that. But so with all of your work, design, writing, teaching, how can people find you? How can people see samples of your work? How can they hire you? Because that's the other part of this podcast. So I'm trying to get everybody some work. So, how can people find you?
Oh my goodness. I have a website, which is debsivigny.com. So just my name.com. It needs a serious update. That is something that I should have done during pandemic, but I didn't. But I guess it's not over. So I'll do it over the break. And then let's see, I'm on Instagram and Twitter at Indepenguin. So I'll spell that out. It's INDEPENGUIN. So Indie Penguin, which is like independent penguin smashed together. Where else? I have a Patreon at patreon.com/twincat, which is Twin Cat Collective, which I manage with a friend of mine. And that's where I actually do all of my illustration work, because I'm trying to build an entire sort of second, as if I'm not busy enough, I'm trying to build an entire sort of secondary portfolio of illustration, sculpture, painting, etc., just so I remember who I am as an independent artist and not just as a collaborator in theater. So that keeps me busy there.
So with that, thank you for being on the podcast. And anytime you want to come back or talk about other things or things that come to mind, please let us know. We'd love to welcome you back to the show. And I know in season 1 we're mostly kind of one-on-one conversations, but we do want in the future to have small group chats about any kind of hot button topic that we've got going on. So I definitely want to look forward to having you involved in those too. So
awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
All right. Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Producing While Asian podcast. Our theme song was created by Luckstock. We are produced by Press Play Podcast, and the show is edited by Michael Santos Sandoval. If you have a moment, please leave a review and a rating, and be sure to send us any topic ideas you have to producingwhileasian@gmail.com. To follow us, stay updated, and read our blog, visit www.producingwhileasian.com. We hope you join us again soon.